Well, here we are, officially one entry deep into the post-Team Silent era of the Silent Hill franchise, and while there were a few things about Origins I really liked, well, let's just say the new Western developers of the series have not done much to win me over to their side. So you can imagine my dismay when the news concerning the next Silent Hill centered around the idea of reimagining the events of the first game, a game that a lot of us hold very near and dear to our hearts. Now, of course, I'm not saying such a thing isn't possible. I mean, I love the RE2 remake, and that was way more new stuff than old. But when you dig into altering what was a very story-based experience, the red flags become visible from low orbit. Through interviews and trailers, SH fans found out the intent here was to completely rewrite the story of SH1, and let me tell you from experience, there were not a lot of people even remotely happy with that concept. But hey, we're here to see every single thing the town of Silent Hill has to offer, and maybe a new perspective on our first run-in is exactly what the psychologist ordered. So, once again, I'm asking you guys to follow me into the foggy roads of that eerily deserted vacation resort. Ladies, gentlemen, welcome to Silent Hill. The development of Silent Hill Shattered Memories was pretty controversial from the word go. At first, rumors of an SH1 remake had a lot of us very excited for understandable reasons, but the slow trickle of news seemed to be pointing in a very different direction when official sources started to get involved. The word reimagining was getting thrown around a lot, and when you're dealing with a cult classic like Silent Hill, well, that's not the type of nomenclature you want to hear. The story of SH1 was incredibly satisfying already, and a lot of us were worried having a Western developer take a shot at it would negate a lot of the nuance that came from the very foreign concept of psychological horror Team Silent brought to the original. That being said, I always felt like people outside the original Team Silent writing staff would likely never produce an accurate SH story, so the idea of starting from scratch was not the most unattractive thing I could imagine. I mean, I would obviously have preferred this to have been its own spin-off kind of thing, but hey, I'm not so ideologically possessed that I can't see the benefit in having a fresh pair of eyes take a crack at something I love. But that's not to say I was totally open-minded on the subject. The other part of the pre-release hype was the fact that Shattered Memories would be released on Nintendo's Wii, a console that I hold just above the Jaguar in terms of enjoyment. From the start, I was very skeptical of motion controls, and after seeing how poorly they worked in almost every Wii game I ever played, I was counting down the days until they died out. And I know some of you listening to this right now probably like motion controls, and I'm not so rigid I can't admit, listen, sometimes, people are wrong, and obviously that's you. But we had a lot of controversy here before the game even hit shelves. Of course, one could understand this kind of move given the full context. You could call the OG Silent Hill a lot of things, but easy to comprehend would not be one of them. On top of that, the Wii was proving itself to be a gaming milestone for how far it was able to penetrate the casual or even non-gaming market. An SH game on the console would no doubt have to be retooled as far as the story goes, and while I can totally understand how that drove some people mad, I found myself more and more supportive of the idea lately. Well, before we get too far into the weeds, we're gonna need to discuss the particulars of that story.
My daughter's missing.
That road's not in my jurisdiction.
What?
You want state police.
You're kidding.
Just before Shattered Memories released, you couldn't go 5 minutes on the internet without seeing an interview including the word reimagining, which is fitting because that is exactly what this game is, and I'm gonna have to go off the reservation just a bit here, but I don't necessarily think that's such a bad idea. Now, had this have been a proper remake like it was rumored to be, this level of alteration would have put me into some type of psychotic rage. But as it stands, I can think of a million things far worse than viewing SH1's story through a completely different lens with a totally unrelated game backing it up. But I haven't always felt that way. In this game's day, there were no shortage of hardcore SH fans shouting down the developers for messing with what they saw as perfection, myself included. I swore off Shattered Memories based solely on my love for the game it was messing around with, and that lasted literally until I spun this bad boy up for this very review. Looking back with 2020 hindsight, I was being petty and kind of immature. I mean, sure, the idea of changing such an awesome and deep story still gives me chills, but as I played it, it became clear that this was its own thing. It didn't reflect on the original at all and kind of formed into a unique little experience, sometimes using very minor elements of Silent Hill's story as a pool of inspiration. Of course, one could argue such a low level of relation to the source material would kind of negate the whole point of reimagining it, but before we get into that, we should probably cover what exactly that story is.
I wasn't supposed to be here. I shouldn't have been here.
SM starts with a familiar event as we see Harry Mason crashing his car in Silent Hill. But from here, we're taken to a psychotherapy session where a very different Dr. Kaufman starts asking us to delve into some pretty deep-rooted stuff. These therapy sessions are cut into the game after pivotal story points, and both serve as a narrative framing device and act as a kind of psychological profiling type of deal, but as you might assume, it's very basic. Of course, I'll dive deeper into that when we cover gameplay, but I will say I'm a little mixed on how I feel about these parts. Sometimes they play into the story really well, but sometimes Kaufman just changes his established character, which is really off-putting.
Wake up!
Plus, I don't like having to fill out forms and order items when I'm really getting into the game's story. And speaking of which, let's get back on track here. After the car wreck, Harry goes looking for his daughter Cheryl, and this is where all of the similarities stop. Harry spends his time exploring a mostly empty Silent Hill looking for his daughter and ends up meeting characters named after SH1 mainstays, but instead of them all having some kind of involvement with a secret cult or the town's spiritual power, they're just people. Regular people you'd probably expect to see in a small town. Which leads me to the very different feeling this game gives me compared to the original. Shattered Memories feels more like a psychological thriller than a survival horror story. In fact, I got very hard Dark City and In the Mouth of Madness vibes the longer the game went on. There was a lot of stuff the game was hiding from me, and it seemed like everyone I talked to was privy to a lot more info than I was, and actually that's what I like about this game. In SH1, finding Cheryl is your goal, but after an hour or two of gameplay, figuring out what the hell is going on in this town becomes the main draw. You meet a very limited cast of characters, but all of them seem really off in a very David Lynch dream logic kind of way.
Herein lies the mother's womb, containing the power to create life.
In Shattered Memories, the empty town, strange occurrences, and odd characters aren't even the main questions you're going to want to answer. See, this time around, Harry is the mystery that needs to be solved. Who is this guy? Why can't he find his daughter? And why can't he remember very simple parts of his life? Everyone he talks to seems to point out parts of his story not really matching up quite right, and it seems like no one's able to give this guy a straight answer. He sometimes flashes in and out of memories or what seems like made-up events, and you'll sometimes leave a room and have a person you were talking to be replaced by a stranger that seems to know you. You really get the feeling that Harry's losing it, and instead of people being frustratingly cryptic, as is tradition with Silent Hill games, characters in SM don't have answers for Harry's questions because those questions only really make sense to him and us. When Harry returns to the address on his ID, there's someone else living there, and they obviously have no answers for him. To them, he's a stranger spouting gibberish. And given that same exact situation, I don't know if I'd be much help either. This game's version of Sybil isn't very interested in helping Harry, but this time around it's because of how suspicious he is and how much of his story just doesn't add up. I really liked how well this game was able to make me question everything I was seeing. I honestly wondered if what I just saw really happened after nearly every cutscene past the middle of the game. As a matter of fact, this kind of story and this type of experience, well, it plays right into my wheelhouse. As that guy on YouTube who's known for reviewing survival horror games, it may surprise you to learn that I really don't like horror movies much. From ghosts and serial killers to extra-dimensional terrors and masked slashers, I just don't get into 99% of the scary movies out there. However, I have a soft spot for zombie movies and psychological thrillers. I really get into stories that make me feel like I might be losing my mind right along with the movie's lead character, and that's something that SM does very well. I never really felt like I understood what was happening, but at the same time, I always felt like I was just on the verge of figuring it out. That kind of balance is what I often look for in this type of experience, but it's rare that it's done this well in a video game. And here's where I have to go a little deeper than some of you might be down for. If you don't want aspects of this game and the original Silent Hill's ending ruined for you, click the link in the description or skip to the timestamp on screen to avoid serious spoilers. As for the rest of you, now let's jump down this rabbit hole.
Are you on something? I'm Dahlia. Hottest piece of ass you'll ever see in this town.
As you play the game, the developers throw a lot of hints at you that things aren't exactly how Harry thinks they are, and in my opinion, they do a really good job of keeping the exact nature of the endgame revelation relatively hidden in plain sight. And while I'm sure I wasn't the only one who guessed the ending before seeing it, I was still pretty stoked to see how well they pulled it off. So let's go over what we have to work with so far. Harry Mason gets into a car crash in a snowy Silent Hill and begins looking for his daughter. In doing so, he finds out people are living in his house and have been for some time. His 7-year-old was somehow enrolled in the local high school, and an older, slightly pathetic Dahlia claims that they're married, even though Harry has no knowledge of this. So after working our way through both the town and Harry's fractured psyche, we're taken into the last area of the game where Sybil meets us, letting us know that Harry Mason died 18 years ago, mirroring the bad ending of the original game, an ending that, might I mention, I think is unduly shit on. Yeah, maybe nowadays it's kind of cheap, but as an early teen, the idea that the whole game was some kind of fever dream caused by a deadly head injury, well, that hit me right in the feels. Anyways, getting back to the game at hand, upon entering the lighthouse, which was supposed to be the last and only place we could find Cheryl, we're taken into another session with Dr. Kaufman, and as he rails on about accepting the past, our Harry just walks right through the door, revealing that we've been Cheryl the entire time, working her way through accepting the death of her father and the realization that he wasn't the knight in shining armor her 7-year-old mind thought him as.
You've been with me for so long.
I always will be.
I think this was a pretty heart-wrenching scene and worked as a nice in-game reveal. Instead of the supernatural hook I was expecting the entire time, we were just working our way through some damaged woman's memories of her dead father. This fit in perfectly with my love for psychological thrillers and even seemed to be drawing from the same exact design elements. I'm sure some of you will have figured out this scenario by the time this scene takes place, but for me it was a nice little surprise, and the ending with Cheryl packing away all the extra trinkets we found in the game spoke to the idea of challenging the typical and then everyone lived happily ever after type of game ending. It seems like, at least in my interpretation, that there is a chance of Cheryl ending up okay, but overall her dad's still dead and her entire upbringing was worse off because of it. She really has no choice now but to move on, and who knows if that's even going to bring her any more happiness than the fantasy of her dad still being alive did. Honestly, this really got to me. All in all, like I said before, it was a surprisingly emotional end to what was a very enjoyable story, but I think it's time we let the newcomers back in. Alright, so we went over the ending, and for those of you who skipped the spoilers, I want to say I really enjoyed this game's story and how it ended up. It was well told with all kinds of little hints at the resolution scattered around the game, much of which seemed very obvious looking back in hindsight. The psychological elements of the story are very well done and in a respectful way avoid beating you over the head with drawn-out in-game explanations for very subtle details. It really did shock me how much I ended up getting into Harry's exploration through these events, but that being said, there are some elements that were pretty poorly done in my eyes. Throughout the game, there's a very creepy, isolating atmosphere, which is exactly what I wanted, but it seems like the developers weren't very confident in selling the experience solely on that atmosphere alone. So they scattered around a bunch of unrelated creepy text messages and voicemails. How it works is Harry's flashlight will flicker and there'll be a kind of static noise when one of these bits of nonsense are nearby, and then after some kind of ghost explosion or ridiculous shadow person skittering away, you'll get a message that sometimes points towards the game's ending, I think, but mostly they're unrelated events like a boy accidentally drowning his brother or some teenager dying from choking himself while he jerks it.
You have a nice day at school. Sure, Mom. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Sure, Mom. Whoa.
Now don't get me wrong, I don't shy away from dark story elements in my horror games, but that's just it. Shattered Memories isn't a horror game. As far as its story is concerned, it is strictly a psychological thriller. All of the weird horror elements don't tie into the overall narrative and end up feeling out of place. Now, there are some messages that angle towards parents fighting and divorce, things like that, which does help along the general point of the story, but the quote-unquote scary stories you find are just kind of pathetic feeling in comparison. It's like you're reading a really good Lovecraft tale, turn the page, and suddenly Freddy Krueger starts carving up teens in their underwear. It just clashes really hard. Of course, these little tidbits aren't so common that they ruin the tone of the story by themselves, and as a plus, if you don't want to, you never really have to see them. So as far as complaints go, this is a pretty minor one, which means you know damn well there's a bigger one to discuss, and that is the Silent Hill elements of the story. Like I said before, I really and truly enjoyed this story and even respected the hell out of the process used to tell it. But throughout the entire experience, I just kept wondering why the hell this needed to be an SH game. There are no elements that tie it into the series at large, minus the mandatory in new Silent Hill games inclusion of the town helping characters through their mental baggage. I mean, SH2 was a totally unrelated affair as far as the core SH story was concerned, but it at least felt like it took place in the same world and timeline. This story, for all of its quality and style, never once broaches anything even approaching a common Silent Hill theme. The only thing that's been carried over is the beginning 2 minutes of the first game and the names of the characters in town. Those characters don't have the same roles, and the town doesn't function like it does in the original, so I'm left wondering why it needed to say Silent Hill on the box. I would have enjoyed this tale just as much, if not more, if our main character wasn't Harry Mason. This could have been a groundbreaking psychological experience on a console that was sorely hurting for such a thing, but instead the developers decided to strap on all the baggage that comes with reimagining a very beloved and well-established franchise. I'm sure there are plenty of you watching right now who never touched this game for that exact reason, and that really sucks because all of us missed out on a really deep and meaningful story in the process. I guess my point is, despite all of the care and talent that went into writing such a cool story, there was just no need to call this a Silent Hill game. As a matter of fact, I get the feeling that the association with the rest of the series might have drugged the process down a bit. But with those two complaints out of the way, I have both surprised myself and likely a lot of you. I just did not expect to like this game as much as I did. The original Silent Hill story was one of my first run-ins with a truly deep and touching video game narrative, and the thought of altering that even a little bit turned me off until this retrospective forced me to play through it. So what I'm trying to say is, don't be like me. I missed out on a really interesting and well-told story. If you like games that challenge you mentally and force you to consider deep psychological issues in a really creative way, well, you aren't exactly flush with options, are you? So make sure you experience this story for yourself. I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did, but now that I have, I want all of you to as well. Much like the story, Shattered Memories controls had a lot of opposition from me right out of the gate. I've been a very vocal detractor of the waggle controls found in most Wii games, and more specifically, I just didn't feel like that approach has any business being in a Silent Hill game. Now, I have some good news and some bad news, and since I'm an optimist, we'll go with the good first. About 75% of the game controls really well. The pointing and aiming of the flashlight works perfectly and does feel novel enough to warrant a play. Of course, it does suffer from the typical issues that comes with motion controls, but given the circumstances, I doubt there would have been any way to avoid them. To be more specific, it gets kind of tiring holding your wrist in the same awkward position for an extended period of time, and anytime I wanted to reach for the record button in my capture software or grab a drink or something, I was stuck watching Harry spin in endless circles until I got my controller back to where the sensors could see it. Annoying little issues to be sure, but a majority of the time I was completely satisfied. And before we get into the aforementioned bad stuff, we should probably talk about what I like to call Shattered Memories' split gameplay model. See, most of the game is spent in the town just kind of wandering around, and in these portions you'll be either using the Wiimote to shine your flashlight and adjust your perspective, or you'll be solving very, and I can't stress this enough, very simple motion control puzzles. An approach that sounds like a losing idea on paper, but something about the environment combined with its atmosphere, man, it just made me fall in love with these parts of the game. The devs seem to have struck this perfect balance between making the world seem bleak and uninviting, but still interesting enough that I wanted to explore every little area I could find. It actually kind of reminded me of the Stalker games, a series of Ukrainian first-person shooters that has you exploring the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. In those games, the vast majority of the gigantic maps on offer are uninhabited and offer no reward for exploration, but the environment was built in such a way that you just can't help but do that. I think SM has the same exact feeling, even though my only reward for going off the beaten path was the odd trinket, which by the way has no impact on the story, or a quip from Harry triggered when zooming in on specific items in the environment. I just wanted to do it. On top of that, you have an in-game cell phone that lets you take pictures, check your map, and receive messages. And I gotta say, the integration of this little gimmick into the game world, while very minor, is actually pretty cool. Examining your environment will have you come across all kinds of phone numbers, each one actually dialable, and while it never does much outside of minor world building, I still thought it was a really cool idea. Further utilizing this idea, certain spots in the environment will trigger a message from the people of Silent Hill, sometimes acting as an analog for Harry's real-world situation, and just like I said before, these little pieces of side content end up feeling kind of cheap, given how well the rest of the game is able to rely solely on the grim atmosphere of its setting. Having a crying child desperately trying to find help for his drowning brother, while dark and depressing in its own way, just doesn't feel right here, since you know full well it has no bearing on the game's story and will never be brought up again. Aside from that one very small complaint though, I honestly don't know why, but something about the way Silent Hill looks and feels in this game just inspired me to see more of it. I found myself dreading moving on to the next area since I was never sure I'd seen everything. If you're asking me, the entire game could have been these slow-moving investigation areas, and I would have been totally happy. Sadly, that is most definitely not the case, so we're gonna have to get into that bad stuff I was talking about earlier. The other 25% of the game consists of these chase sequences, and God, I really do not like these things. The motion controls that worked perfectly in the slow-moving exploration scenes really don't lend themselves to fast-paced running, where you may need to make very sharp turns and pull off some complicated movements. How it goes is, you'll see the world ice over, much like the transition to the original's Otherworld, and then you'll need to run your ass off to avoid getting grabbed by one of the game's one and only enemies. Once you're grabbed, you're going to have to do some Wiimote waggling based on where they're at on your body, and I never quite felt like I was getting these right. Specifically when they're latched onto my back, I'd be performing the exact motion that was displayed on screen, but Harry just would refuse to throw these guys off. And to add to the frustration, this also happens when you're doing the right motion. Randomly, Harry will throw the enemy off on the very first try, but sometimes that's not the case, and there will be little to no visual indication that you're doing the right movements. So I was stuck constantly wondering if I wasn't throwing a monster off due to me not performing the right motion cue or the game's random nature. As far as movement is concerned, you're going to need to be making a lot of snap decisions, which does not bode well for using a Wiimote to turn your perspective. Now, each of these are essentially a maze that loops back in on itself, and oftentimes you're going to need to run through it a fair number of times before you figure out the right combination of turns. Of course, you could pull out your map on your phone, but that requires awkwardly reaching your thumb up to the D-pad on the Wiimote and then having Harry stop his sprint and reaching down to the A button so you could zoom the map in. Now, this is possible in the very first areas since you won't be as swamped with enemies, but towards the middle to end of the game, pulling out your phone can just be a shortcut to an instant game over. Speaking of which, dying will only drop you back at an entry point or sometimes a midpoint of the area, which is more of an annoyance than anything. And since there's no real weight to dying in this game, it doesn't feel like a loss, more like a time-wasting mechanic, especially when I often felt like a death wasn't my fault, either due to the wacky motion controls or the fact that I couldn't get up over a barrier. Now, how this is supposed to work is you hit A to jump over something, open a door, or do whatever, but while you're running, these actions are supposed to be automatic. The key word there being supposed to be. More often than not, the wide berth needed for turning with the Wiimote's look controls means I was approaching obstacles at very odd angles, and the automatic actions never kicked in, which would cost me a few milliseconds, aka just enough time to have 3 monsters grab me from behind. I probably don't need to say this, but these parts of the game were incredibly frustrating and really clashed with the rest of the game for me. Most of the time I'd be slowly exploring an area, really drinking in the atmosphere, and then I'd see the world start to ice over and I'd get pissed off at the thought of stopping the fun gameplay I was doing to solve some kind of simple maze. And the fact that these are the only times in the game when you're in danger of failing kind of makes for a bad dynamic. The pacing of the exploration/investigation scenes is so well done, and then for some reason the developers shoehorn in this really awkwardly controlled high-intensity chase scene. You know that one scene from Tom Savini's Night of the Living Dead where Tony Todd is delivering that heart-wrenching monologue about what he had seen in Carson City? Well, imagine if they would have just abruptly cut to a car chase in the next scene. That's what it feels like. I get that there had to be some stakes in the game, and I get the idea of resetting the player's expectation at certain points, but I would have liked to have seen these otherworld/enemy sections integrated more fluidly into the overall gameplay here. And on a much smaller note, it seems really odd the ability to peek through doors was included here. I mean, sure, you could argue it was good for avoiding enemies in the chase sequences, but you already know where those enemies are. Just move your cursor over a door and the static will let you know exactly what's on the other side. And on top of that, you're gonna have to go through the door anyways. Why drag it out? Compounding that issue is the fact that the same mechanic exists in the normal world where there are no enemies. All this does is just slow down the pace at which you can explore, and even though it was a very minor annoyance, I still would have liked to have seen a version of the game where this wasn't included. And since we're already bitching, why not continue? Like I mentioned before, the game makes a lot of effort to let you know that it'll be profiling you in order to form the game to your exact sensibilities, but this is dumb for a lot of reasons. First off, the way in which this is accomplished runs counter to the intended gameplay. Sure, answering a questionnaire in the therapy sessions isn't too intrusive, but the game also keeps track of the things you look at while exploring. The only problem there is they made the game world so damn interesting, I wanted to look at everything. Parts of the game that had advertisements for lingerie or mannequins modeling sexy clothes had me terrified to look at them lest the game label me as some type of pervert. And worst of all, they don't have an effect on much of anything. I mean, if you think having the main character wear a different shirt in some scenes is a massive payoff for this kind of nonsense, well, I guess more power to you, but I just don't see the point in it. Now, I know I'm walking a very thin line here since I just got done praising the hell out of the game's exploration, atmosphere, and general mood, and now I'm ripping it for some dead serious problems, so I want to be very clear. The vast majority of this game had me wrapped around its finger. I was truly enveloped in the world and enjoyed the absolute hell out of exploring it. The film noir vibes I got while searching the empty town for Cheryl just can't be overstated, and I really want to mention again, these exploration scenes are absolutely the reason you should be playing. That being said, these chase sequences nearly ruin the game for me, emphasis on nearly. Of course, there's always the chance that my bias against motion controls and my own preferences could be at fault here, but either way, rest assured the rest of the game makes up for the flaws I just listed. Of course, talking about Shattered Memories gameplay is not a simple binary matter since we have a healthy amount of ports to take into account here. SM was released first on the Wii, but also made its way onto the PS2 and my favorite handheld of all time, the PSP. So how did they fare? Well, let's start with the PS2. Over on Sony's little black rectangle, the experience is relatively similar all things considered. And yeah, you're going to lose your ability to move your flashlight with your actual real-world hand, but you can use the right analog stick to accomplish that same exact goal. And while I will admit it does feel much more fluid using motion controls, I was also really happy not to have the downsides of those controls present. During chase scenes, you're going to have to perform quick time events instead of waggle controls, and I gotta say, this is much more agreeable with me. I may not like QTEs in general, but they work here, or at least they work much more effectively than motion controls. I'm not a big fan of the button overlays on screen, but I have to assume they'll go away after the first few areas like it did in the Wii release. Moving on, you can expect more of the same from the PSP release, and I have to say how impressed I am to see this full Wii and PS2 game working in the exact same way on such a limited platform. Every single part of the base game is here, and much like the other two options, I had way more fun playing a single father detective than running from faceless pink things. In both the PS2 and PSP versions, the motion control puzzles are still workable, only this time with the visible cursor being controlled by the analog sticks. And this concession doesn't detract from the experience at all in my opinion. One thing to note is a much more noticeable amount of slowdown in the portable iteration, but given the platform, I think that should be expected. And truth be told, neither home port escapes moments of slowdown either. For some reason, the loading between areas seems to be a major hit on performance for each platform, but oddly enough, the PSP version skates away with the least amount of this. So it's a wash as far as which one works best. What isn't, however, is the fact that both Sony ports control much more reliably in the chase scenes. Since you're not required to bring an on-screen cursor to the edges of the display in order to turn, they automatically feel much better while running. Although these portions of the game still aren't very fun, they're just much more tolerable. Honestly, I would love to recommend these two Sony ports as the best way to play the game given my obvious bias for their consoles, but even I can admit the motion controls work really well for pointing your flashlight, and call me crazy, they do a great job at immersing me further into the game world. I really wish there was a way to include the great motion controls from the exploration areas and mix them with the traditional controls from the PS2 and PSP chase scenes, because that would without a doubt make for a much better game. But since the Wiimote really did a great job as a stand-in for a flashlight, I've got to go with the original Wii release as my recommendation. Now keep in mind the other two are not very far behind that version at all, so if you can only get one of them, you're not going to be playing with any kind of major handicap. So of course feel free to pick the right one for your situation and your setup. All things considered, gameplay was another avenue that surprised the absolute hell out of me. While the story did a lot to keep me interested, the awesome exploring and investigating were the real draws for me. I really and truly did not expect to like this game as much as I do, and I'm happy to say even the very badly designed parts of it don't detract from that. It does kind of feel like two separate teams are responsible for the two gameplay types, but 90% of the game gets a big thumbs up from me, and that coming from a hardcore fan of the original entries in the series should really hold some weight. If you're like me and stayed away from this title strictly based on your loyalty to the game it's trying to reimagine, well, I'd recommend you putting your series allegiances to the side and experience a really interesting game. I know it may be kind of hard to lock onto here with just my words and a few images on screen, but trust me, I didn't think I'd be enjoying a game that was mostly shining a flashlight at old sales flyers either. For some reason, it all just works and manages to be one of the most immersive experiences you can have with a Wiimote in your hands. Without a doubt, Shattered Memories did its namesake and shattered a lot of my pre-existing biases. So if you like a little detective work sprinkled on your dark and depressing exploration of an abandoned town, which who doesn't, maybe dust your old Wii off for a little bit, or at least update the plugins in your Dolphin emulator. This is one modern SH game that deserves a lot more love, and I can assure you that was incredibly hard for me to say.
Come on, son. Finish it. I am ashamed to be your father.
Just like gameplay and story, Shattered Memories has a lot of really impressive things to offer graphically speaking. If you'll remember, I was pretty let down when Silent Hill 4 The Room had such bland, middle-of-the-road lighting, and I'm here to say Shattered Memories more than makes up for that. The real-time, perspective-correct shadows cast by your flashlight are very impressive and even outshine RE Darkside Chronicles, which used to be my benchmark for how good lighting could be on the Wii's meager resources. Of course, they're not perfect, and you will see objects casting shadows onto parts of the environment in very odd ways or weird angles, but 99% of the time, the lighting engine had me totally impressed. On top of this, it's clear that a lot of time was spent on facial animations, and without looking into it too much, I would assume some type of motion capture work was done to get this effect, because these animations are pretty spot on most of the time. Of course, I did come across some animatronic-looking conversations, but overall, this game seems to follow in the footsteps of its forefathers as far as graphical benchmarks go. Texture work in SM is pretty passable in my opinion, meaning there wasn't anything that particularly blew me away, but at the same time, I never saw any blurry work or anything that stood out as low quality or effort. But that description only goes for the 3D texture work. The 2D art on display here is doing something I genuinely haven't ever seen before in a 480p game.
911. Phone's out.
As you move around Silent Hill, you'll find all kinds of assets, from flyers plastered on walls to signposts and magazines, and I was blown away when I found that each and every one of these 2D objects can be zoomed in on, revealing incredibly high-res assets. In fact, they're so high-res that every piece of text in these advertisements and men's room graffiti is totally legible. I feel like this requires some very serious custom-made scaling operations going on in the background, since this is not the case when you're just looking around unzoomed in. And if you're looking for it, you can kind of catch the process taking place as you zoom in on something. Honestly guys, I had no idea this was even possible on a game running on the Wii. I mean, these are some of the most high-res 2D assets I've ever seen before. And keep in mind, there's text in the RE2 remake that is nowhere near as readable as even the most small, insignificant piece of paper in SM. No joke, I examined every little thing I came across, and it never got old zooming in on some old worn sign and perfectly making out exactly what it says. Look, I know I'm harping on about this one feature here, but damn, I really just can't comprehend a game running at such a low internal resolution but having such complicated scaling and such high-res assets going on inside of it. Color me impressed. Other than the mind-blowing 2D stuff, the town of Silent Hill is really well designed and does an amazing job of capturing that initial SH design while putting its own little twist on things. I mean, the place still feels like a ghost town somewhere around New England, but the devs shine their own little light on it, and I like that. A practice I probably would not have been so happy about had this not have been pushed so hard as a reimagining. I think the ice effect that replaced the rust and chain link look of the other world is cool on paper, but in practice it just kind of simplifies the environment and doesn't really add a lot. That being said, it's pretty cool watching the world change around you in real time, an effect I'm sure taxed the absolute hell out of the Wii's tiny little amount of memory. Just like the high-res 2D art, it's clear a lot of effort was put into designing certain interior areas in a relatively realistic way. The insides of cars and puzzle elements are all pretty convincing, and everything is where you'd expect it to be, which is a good thing when you'll have to interact with these elements a fair amount. Overall, for a 480p game from a bygone era, Shattered Memories impressed the absolute hell out of me with its presentation. Sure, on the surface it's got what I would call an expected look to its graphics, but Underneath that surface level, there's some real magic going on. Of course, nothing is perfect, and there were a few hiccups I noticed. Slowdown is a pretty common affair here on the Wii version of the game, which is understandable in the areas where the regular and otherworld versions of the environment are both loaded into memory, but it's kind of annoying nonetheless. On top of that, there were these odd hitches while the game was loading mid-cutscene.
What is this place?
It's a boat. It's like a car, but goes on water.
I think it loads dialogue specific to the choices you made, which would explain why it needs to load before certain parts of a conversation, but since I'm playing this off of a pretty crappy mechanical hard drive, the dialogue loading in would skip or repeat to make up for it having to spin up and look for the data. I imagine those of you playing off a real disc probably won't encounter this same bug, so I wouldn't worry about it. And since we have a lot to cover in this department, let's hurry up and move on to my favorite part of these videos, covering the ports. Shattered Memories hit a fair amount of platforms in its day, and since I've been on a huge PS2 kick lately, well, let's start there. And I'm happy to report this release cuts no corners that I've been able to find. The real-time shadows and high-res 2D assets are all here, and there have been zero concessions made, minus one very small detail. It's more common than not for Wii games to run at 480p, but as some of you will already know, the PS2 was more of a 480i platform, so you'll see a noticeable drop in detail thanks to the halved vertical resolution, but if you're playing on a CRT, this will be way less obvious. Another very small bump in the road comes from displaying that interlaced picture on a modern display. As you guys will likely know by now, I feed all of my retro video through the FrameMeister for the purposes of upscaling, and despite what others say on the matter, I think it does a killer job at deinterlacing 480i. That being said, it does have its downsides. The adapted deinterlacing used here typically does its job without issue, but games with a lot of slowdown show combing artifacts way more often than games that hit 60 frames per second more often. Not really sure why that is, but every once in a while you'll see these interlocking lines on parts of the picture that are in motion. Aside from that, there's a very clear increase in the amount of slowdown you'll see in wide open areas, which I think was the result of a very mediocre porting job. Don't get me wrong, it was awesome to see no graphical elements were left on the cutting room floor, but the PS2 had software and hardware advantages over the Wii that should have made something like this very doable at 60 FPS. Which is probably for the best, since I can't recommend this version, as for some reason its price has hit the atmosphere in the secondhand collecting market. I have issues spending more than $20 on a retro game, over $100 would likely kill me. So let's move on to a much more interesting and reasonably priced release. Now, I'll admit to being very impressed by the original Wii version of SM, but I did not in a million years expect for every single graphical trick to make it into the PSP port. The shadows, progressive scan resolution, high-res 2D assets, scaling, it's all here and working perfectly. Of course, as you might expect, the 3D textures are definitely more muddy, and I can't tell for sure, but I think the 3D models are a little less complex, but hot damn is this a good-looking portable title. And in a cool little twist, I recently snagged myself an open source scan converter, a line multiplier that I honestly thought I'd never get into, but now that I have it, man, I wish I would have grabbed it sooner. It may suck ass at dealing with interlace content, but it handles progressive resolutions like a dream. After getting to know the settings a little, which admittedly was a nightmare, I was able to pull an amazingly sharp picture out of my PSP using its component output into the OSSC for line doubling, and then that output going into the FrameMeister for zooming. Without a doubt, you guys are going to be seeing way more OSSC footage here in the future, but you didn't come here for all that. Instead, let's take a look at all three contenders side by side. As you can see, the Wii has the highest fidelity picture, but the PSP's amazing video output has the Wii beat in sharpness, even if it's only due to a lower operating resolution. Honestly, I'd have a hard time recommending any one of these as the definitive best way to play the game. I'd say the PSP version gets my vote simply for the novelty of it, but I really can't deny how great the Wii release looks. I imagine those of you running CRTs in your setup would likely get an even more appealing picture here with any of these options, so I guess just go with what works best for you, and rest assured this is one of the most impressive titles I've ever covered here, given the context. Sure, there are plenty of great looking PS2 titles, the earlier SH games definitely included, but even those classics can't hold a candle to some of the downright amazing things going on under the hood here. Now, it's totally possible that all of this will only matter to people like me who have a hardcore interest in graphical tricks like this, but I'd say if you're even a little curious about these kind of things, Shattered Memories more than deserves your attention.
Stop talking! You can't talk me out of this!
I'm not here to stop you.
So I guess it should be obvious by now, but I wholeheartedly recommend Shattered Memories. I was really down on the idea of recreating Silent Hill 1 for obvious reasons, but I'm very happy to say that this game is an amazingly good time regardless. I don't think the original property did much of anything for the finished product outside of providing a few character names, but all that aside, I had a really good time with this one. It did some pretty interesting stuff with its story, nailed the somber atmosphere it was going for, and accomplished some truly groundbreaking technical effects. If there were one modern SH game that would make me let go of my negative bias, it would be this one. And I think that might explain a bit of my revelry here. I went into this game absolutely expecting to hate it, and every positive thing I saw and experienced started to stack exponentially. I can't guarantee that those of you who have no strong feelings either way will get the same effect, but I'm certain you guys who line up on my side of the original versus modern SH argument will like what's on offer here. And I guess that's about all I have to say on the subject, but I appreciate you guys sitting down and sharing your time with me, and here's hoping I see all of you again right here on the Silent Hill Retrospective.
You seem to see the creepy in everything. Is that a nurse thing or just you?
Definitely a nurse thing. We have a unique outlook on life.
Whatever happened to bedside manner?
We still got that. For special cases.
Well, hey there guys, thanks for popping by. If you like Silent Hill, I have some more videos linked here on screen, and if you get into what I'm doing here, maybe check out my Patreon page where you can help me put out more independent game reviews just like this. Other than that, I think you should try to take a step outside your comfort zone today. I did with this game, and I was pleasantly surprised with what I found. I can't guarantee you'll have the same outcome, but I can guarantee that you won't if you don't try. God, I sound like a hang in there poster. Well, whatever. You guys have a good one.